Hello, everyone. I'm Lynn Cremando for YogaUOnline, and I'm here today with Diana Zotos Florio. Diana is a physical therapist, yoga teacher, certified strength and conditioning specialist, and a co-founder of what she calls Three's Fizzy Yoga Method. In her work, she's dedicated herself to bridging the gap between yoga and healthcare by training both teachers, yoga teachers, and physical therapists in her method. Before devoting her time full-time to this work, Diana worked for a number of years as a physical therapist at the renowned Hospital for Special Surgery in New York, where her clients ranged from inpatients recovering from joint replacement to professional marathon runners. She received her degree in biology from American University and her master's degree in physical therapy from Hunter College. So welcome, Diana.
Thank you, Lynn.
Speak with you. Now, you've dedicated a big chunk of both your website and your work to what we call the core, and that's a really hot topic right now, both in yoga and just in the movement world in general. And I want to dive into it, but first I really just have to ask about that name. Number one, why threes and not three? And number two, what is Fizzy Yoga?
Sure, good questions. So threes is reflective of a myriad of principles and things that we reference often in our method. We talk about and define health and wellness as the mixture and the harmony of mind, body, and spirit. So that's one triad that we reference often in how we define and teach about the body. We are, a beautiful architecture of systems. We aren't just mind, we aren't just body, we aren't just spirit. We are all of those together, and every single aspect of what's happening in our mind and what's happening in our body and what's happening in our spiritual connection to ourselves and to the community and the environment has a direct influence on our health and how we feel and how we are engaged in life. Threes also refers to something we talk and teach a lot about in the hands and the feet, which is the tripod. There is a tripod of support that we reference in our feet, the center of the heel, the big toe knuckle, the baby toe knuckle. There's a tripod of support in the hand as well. And it's through this tripod and through connecting to the earth with this tripod that we find ideal positioning of our joints, openness for proprioception, and awareness of how we're feeling and connecting to the earth. So we talk a lot about the tripod. We teach our training in 3 different pieces. So anytime we're doing a Fizzy Yoga teacher training, we always begin with the knowledge foundations. That's the science that you'll need to understand Fizzy Yoga. It's neuroscience, it's physiology, it's anatomy, it's biomechanics, it's kinesiology. And then we'll layer on the assessment component. How to look at the class and make decisions, or how to interview someone in a biopsychosocial spiritual way, or how to do a functional movement assessment using asana. That's the assessment component of our method. And then the third part, the third 3 or the fourth 3 is restoration. How to use tools that are influenced by neuroscience and physical therapy principles to create and make a change. It doesn't need to be a change to help with an injury or help with performance, but maybe just help to create a little bit more awareness or a little bit more space or a little bit more grounding or a little bit more balance. So those are our 3 pieces of how we teach Threes Fizzy Yoga. So, and there are more, there's more 3s that I can think of, but we just sat there one day, Emily and I, after finishing a workshop, in-person workshop in Brooklyn. And we started thinking that we had to rename our company because we were Fizzy Yoga Global. And we were having conversations with attorneys, and they're like, there's just no way you can name your company Fizzy Yoga Global. There's no identifiable factor. You have to think about trademarking your name, and using a word like global is not trademarkable. You got to think like different, like Apple as in computers, is a nice trademarkable name because Apple doesn't really correlate to computers. And so because it's distinct and different, it's a great trademarkable name. Threes is a great trademarkable name for a header in front of Fizzy Yoga. Yes.
Now, and you referenced Emily, that's your partner who is your co-founder?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Method. Okay.
That's right. Emily and I met. Yes. Mm-hmm. Emily and I met at the hospital for special surgery and sort of came up with Fizzy Yoga together. Fizzy Yoga is a combination or a merging of the therapeutic pieces of yoga, including the breath work and the mindfulness, the embodiment, the awareness, the connection. All of those pieces layered on top of physical therapy principles of movement. And so teaching movement that is based in how we know the body works optimally and most efficiently, using physical therapy principles to break down and build up movement, but doing it in an embodied, aware, connected, yoking the mind-body way.
Excellent. Excellent. And that makes you then the perfect person to kind of dive into this topic of core, because when most people are talking about core, first of all, I'm going to ask you to just very briefly, so we are all on the same page.
Sure.
Because there are people who have their own definition for core. How do you define core? It's become kind of like Kleenex or Xerox. What's your definition of core before we go a little deeper?
Sure. I've really shifted in the last few years to define the core as a complex but automatic system that lives in the center of our body. And I like to keep it there, really.
So you're not limiting it to a specific group of muscles. You're limiting it more to a functional definition.
Yeah, it's not, you can't just limit it to muscles. It's not just muscles. It's so much more than muscles, just like all of our body is. But the core specifically is just, there are so many more bodily systems involved than just muscles that it's, I think, outright wrong at this point to just define the core as a set of muscles.
So that's why I wanted to kind of drill down a little bit, because most of the time, as popular it is when people are talking about the core, they're talking about muscle strength. They're talking about how your, t-shirt looks, and sometimes about your posture or whatever. But in fact, having a kind of a structural foundation that is synchronous and balanced and resilient, as you've described it, and as you've described looking at the whole person, there's just so much more involved. So I'd like you, having defined the core, to now talk about the importance of and how you view working with it.
Sure. Yeah, I think your definition is wonderful, the synchronous, balanced, and resilient piece of our body. And I can talk a little bit about what those words mean in relationship to the core. But I want to talk a little bit more about why I say it's just wrong to think about the core as muscles. And this really became evident for me working with a population of people who were both postpartum or had chronic low back injuries or constipation issues. So this is how I feel like I figured out the core, or I mean, lots of people know this, but this is how I really started to see that the core is not just muscles. So when you look at someone whose core is not functioning well, postpartum, low back, abdominal issues, it becomes obvious quickly that there is so much more involved in how this part of our body works well. So with someone who's postpartum, they may have had issues reconnecting to their core through their brain. So that's how we know, one, the brain's involved. After your postpartum, it's kind of like after a delivery or a pregnancy and then a birth, it's kind of like a big trauma, a big deal. I often talk about it, how it's kind of like having your ACL operated on. It's a big deal. You need to have rehab Because when you have your ACL operated on, you lose connection to your quad, which is just one muscle, and you have to re-educate it through the brain. When you have a baby or chronic low back pain or abdominal problems, you have to re-educate your core from the brain, not just one muscle, but a whole entire group of muscles. That's the first piece of kind of working with a dysfunctional core, adding in that brain neuro re-education motor learning piece, which is a lot of what Fizzy yoga is based on. Teaching the brain how to reconnect and work with the core well. The other pieces that become evident when you're working with a dysfunctional core is that the muscles of the core aren't going to get stronger and more automatic and more efficient if your posture isn't as optimal as it is or can be when you want to work those muscles.
Mm-hmm.
And why is posture important? Because we have to think about what's happening inside the core. Inside the core, so below the rib cage and above the pelvic floor diaphragm is what I define as the core. That's a big open space with a lot of viscera and abdominal contents inside. There is a system of internal abdominal, intra-abdominal pressure, internal pressure that happens and is contained within that space below the respiratory diaphragm and pelvic floor. The pressure increases when we need more stability in that region to protect our lumbar vertebra, but also to protect all of our vital internal organs, bowel, bladder, digestion, sexual organs, urogenital. Pressure can also decrease. And when pressure decreases, that's so the core is less rigid and tight. And so we could be more mobile. We can do things like twists and forward folds and really round and segmentally mobilize through the spine. The way that the pressure increases and decreases is reliant on the respiratory diaphragm and the pelvic floor diaphragm and their work to kind of close valves and keep pressure inside.
Can I just stop you for 1 second?
Sure.
Because this is really interesting about the pressure.
Yeah.
How would I know if the pressure was high or the pressure was low? Would I have symptoms? Would I be feeling something?
Mm-hmm.
And is it good to have high pressure sometimes, low pressure sometimes? What is the consequence of that pressure? Because I'm getting that that's a really important component here.
It's a huge component. What you said, I think you called the core reflexive.
Uh-huh.
So the core, the pressure inside the core should change hundreds of times a day.
Mm-hmm.
And that change comes from the brain. So right now we're both sitting in chairs. We should have pretty low pressure in our core, a 1 or a 2 out of 10. But if you and I were to stand up and if I was to try and lift my desk, now I need more pressure.
There you go. Okay.
Yeah. So now it should go up to like a 5 or a 6 or a 7 out of 10. If I'm doing a plank, it should be like an 8 out of 10.
Yeah.
The pressure increases in response to the task at hand. It's a supply and demand.
So you want it to be responsive.
That's right. Yep.
At your will when you want it to be responsive and not
constantly stay.
Exactly. Got it. Okay.
But sometimes we think sometimes the pressure can become dysregulated and not as automatic. And that can happen for a huge amount of reasons. But one interesting reason is say you had chronic back pain and you went to a physical therapist and that PT said, oh, Lynn, the best thing you can do is suck your belly in all day to protect your back. Mm-hmm. That would be a terrible thing to say because you don't need that much pressure all the time in your core. You don't need that much rigidity. Or say you were not a very good diaphragmatic breather. Now the diaphragm is the lid, the top valve of locking pressure in. So if you're not using your diaphragm to breathe, you're losing the ability to regulate your internal abdominal pressure from the diaphragm. Or say you were a pelvic floor gripper, you were a butt squeezer. Yeah. That's another.
And I think a lot of people don't realize that those are both diaphragms, the pelvic floor and also
The glottis.
The glottis, that you have actually three. Now I've read that there are more than three, but those are the three main ones. Is that right?
Yeah. Those are the
So
three
you're
we
syncing
teach
them
about.
all.
Yes, reflexively and automatically. It's a postural support and stabilization system. They should all sort of respond automatically to the task at hand. A Valsalva is an extreme example of this. So when you kind of hold your breath, right? If you're bearing down or if you're about to really like push a couch, doing a Valsalva, you lock in your diaphragm, you lock up your pelvic floor and your glottis closes. So you're locking in as much pressure as you can inside your body to make you really rigid so that you can be stiff. So your spine isn't moving, but also so you can transfer the force from your legs. So ideally, if you're pushing a couch, your legs should, your quads and your glutes should drive. And then that energy, that force should move through your core because you've locked it in. It's like this big energy transfer system, and then move into your arms. The core is an energy transfer system and a stabilizer.
Getting that. And so the people who are just working on, I want to do 1,000 sit-ups, are completely missing the boat of what a much bigger picture this is and how much more important. And one of the things you mentioned was this canister that kind of contains everything. And one thing that there's a huge component of is the spinal cord. So is there a nervous system aspect to this internal pressure system as well?
Yeah. And any group of muscles is going to send signals to and from the brain, sensory signals that are going to go from the muscles up to the brain and then read by the brain, and then motor signals, which are going to come out from the cortex, the motor cortex, and into the muscles. And those signals can become upregulated or downregulated depending on the task at hand. And so we really do rely on the brain and its sort of patterns that we establish to engage the muscles around the core at the right level for the task at hand. And so it's the motor patterns that we establish through habit that drive how much effort, say, my transverse abdominis and my rectus abdominis and my obliques engage with when I go into a plank or when I go to lift my child up. And sometimes those patterns can be established incorrectly. So it's getting to like the postpartum woman. Some postpartum women become very disconnected from their core, like a surgery, like a surgical procedure. They just, the trauma of that whole experience can cause disconnect. And we work through sort of motor learning, reconnecting the brain to telling the muscles kind of what to do through different tasks to reestablish, okay, brain, I'm about to lift my kid. The first thing we should do is engage the pelvic floor, the diaphragm, and the core muscles at a certain level out of 10. And then we should use my biceps to pick my child up. Kind of want to train the brain to work the core to stabilize the trunk first. And then so that trunk is stable and I can be more efficient with my arms. So
core, I'm not even going to call it core strength anymore because I feel like that's the wrong word, but core resilience and core health contains the muscles that we talk about.
Yes.
But there's also a very big, what you're describing, a really big physiological function. You've got breath, you've got circulation, you've got bladder and bowel, you've got, I'm assuming, because the pelvic floor is involved, you've got sexual response and spinal stability. It's all in there. And it's all about, don't just think of squeezing, think of balancing this pressure system.
Yeah.
Now, how can we do that in our yoga practice? Because that sounded really intriguing. And then I'm thinking,
how do we do that? Yeah.
Do that with a downward facing dog. Yeah. How do we do that? How do you bring that into yoga practice?
I think one of the most powerful tools we have is awareness. So I'd love to just always bring it back to that. You can very easily just begin with paying attention to pieces of your core in your yoga practice. How stiff are the muscles engaging around your midsection? Do you feel your pelvic floor region at all? Can you feel it move at all with breath? Can you feel your diaphragm or your rib cage move with breath? It's a wonderful place to begin. It's an easy place, an accessible place to begin. And what that can do is give us information, and without judgment, but say, oh, well, I really feel like I'm holding really tight in my midsection in this downward dog, and I actually can't take a full diaphragmatic breath. Well, then it's like, well, do you really need that? Yeah. Is it serving you? And then, from there, then I would take the more Fizzy yoga type approach where we would sort of build it from the basics and then start to integrate. So we focus on sort of finding the core first in an isolated way. So I always begin with trying to find this neutral position of the rib cage over the pelvis, and then trying to sink the diaphragm through breath and feeling the pelvic floor descend and widen in a coordinated manner with the pelvic floor descending and widening on inhale, and then feeling the opposite on exhale. I call the runway for the airplane of the core to function. If you can get those diaphragms to sink, that's your basis for really working with a reflexive intra-abdominal pressure.
Nice. When you were
then you can sort of start to train the muscles on top of that, right? But that's if you can find that, I would play with that kind of synchronous breath in seated, downward dog, plank, warrior two, and then you can play with up and down. Then the muscle part's really easy.
Yeah. When you were talking about that person gripping for dear life and thinking that was the be all end all and how they're going to get strong, the word that came into my mind, the yoga word, was avidya, which is that misperception that what you're doing has the effect that you think it's going to have. And in fact, what you're doing is going to have a much different effect because you're not breathing, you're not oxygenating your blood, your cells, you're not creating resilience even in the muscles that you're choking off.
And you're making it harder. It's harder to move with that much effort and stiffness. I like to joke, like my husband is like a college athlete, and so when we first started dating, I would take him to yoga classes, and it would be ridiculous because he would be in there like it's the NFL combine, like dripping sweat after 10 minutes. And I wouldn't really be working that hard at all because it's not about how hard you try. It's how you do it. But he would be trying so hard. And with the core and with really anything, it's trying to find that middle ground of not trying too hard, not trying too little. But it's a learning experience for a lot of people, and especially people who are interested in performing yoga well instead of just
having the experience, having a yoga experience. Well, you're going to help us with that because you are going to be teaching a course for us. And I wrote down the name because it's a long name.
I'm so excited.
Exploring the core nexus of the body, keeping keys to balancing the functional pressure system of the body. So you're going to go into much greater detail about all of this and bring it home to yoga.
Yes, absolutely. There is, it's really exciting. We do take it piece by piece, layer by layer, and try to really dispel an understanding of how this all works together. And we do some practical application, and there will be a movement practice that I teach that kind of shows you directly how I would integrate how to teach the core in a yoga class.
I think that's so helpful because these concepts are making so much sense, but then you're saying,
it's new, it's different. It's not,
it's a different thought. It's a different thinking process, which I think a lot of, certainly our audience will be really interested in because we have a lot of intellectual curiosity in our Yoga U, audience. So excited about that. All right. So exploring the core nexus of the body, keys to balancing the functional pressure systems of the body. Diana, thank you so much. This has been so fascinating. I could talk to you about it for a long time, but
Same.
You've got to go out there and get people's cores working. So I'm going to let you go.
Aw, thanks so much.
Thank you so much. We'll see you in class. And for now, see you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.